Thank you, Angela, and also Dom, for inviting me to speak here today. I'm truly honored. I've also enjoyed immensely the talks on the ketogenic diet. So a bit of a comment here, however, that spectacular as the work is, we have some bad news. There's an elephant in the room. That elephant in the room hangs over our shoulders. It's present at every talk on ketogenic diet. That is, you can very well cure almost every disease in Western society: Alzheimer's, autism, cancer, and epilepsy. But of course, all that fat in the diet will clog your arteries and kill you. And so this is what you are faced with whenever you talk about ketogenic diet. In fact, the fear of clogged arteries as a result of the high-fat diet. In fact, we saw that yesterday with Eric Westman's spectacular talk on all the benefits of ketogenic diet, showing completely reversing metabolic symptoms, the metabolic syndrome, and all the benefits. And yet, then we have someone asking him the question after his talk, but what about the cholesterol? The LDL increases. And his response was, but these patients are healthier. Their blood pressures drop, their blood sugar drops. Every metabolic marker improves in metabolic syndrome with ketogenic diet. But she persisted and said, but what about the LDL? And you could sort of see the frustration growing in Eric, saying, forget the damn cholesterol. These people are healthier. But you can't forget the cholesterol. In fact, it's right here at the American Heart Association website today. This diet heart hypothesis that saturated fats are bad fats, that they will increase your cholesterol, and when you increase your cholesterol, you'll then become susceptible to heart disease. So this is the elephant in the room in any talk on ketogenic diet. You save someone from Alzheimer's, but you increase the likelihood that then they'll die of heart disease. So, question is, why should you believe anything I say, especially if I speak against the American Heart Association? Well, a bit about disclosure. Many of you know my story, but I'll share this with you all. Going back a decade or so, I was diagnosed with dyslipidemia at very high risk for developing heart disease. My combination of extremely high triglycerides, very low HDL, and high LDL put me here in the far right section, being at over 15 times greater risk of developing heart disease. And so I took this very seriously, especially when my doctor absolutely urged and demanded that I go on a statin. I didn't even know what a statin was. 10 years ago, I didn't know much about heart disease. My expertise was in the brain. So I decided that before I would go on medication, I needed to learn about cholesterol, my risk for developing heart disease, and what is it that I should eat to reduce that risk of heart disease. And there have just been so many investigators that I have benefited from. And here's a rather small subset of individuals in the books they've written, which I've read over the past decade, and so many more, in which I have learned about cholesterol, nutrition, and heart disease, which I'm going to share with you today. And so this cartoon, to me, actually represents quite well the diet, cholesterol, heart disease hypothesis, in which you have leaders of opinion in the field. And frankly, we have been very sheep-like in accepting what they have said about the relation of diet to cholesterol and heart disease, but these leaders have betrayed our trust and have actually been very much influenced by financial conflict of interest. And so what I'm looking to do is dismantle entirely the diet hypothesis, the diet heart disease hypothesis today. So the first component is, I'm going to actually ask the question, does saturated fat consumption in the context of a low-carb diet, does it actually increase your risk for cardiovascular disease? And second, let's actually look closely at the studies which appear to indicate that high cholesterol actually causes, or at the very least is associated with heart disease and premature death. And of course, everyone is aware of the wonder drugs, the statins, which reduce cholesterol levels and greatly improve cardiovascular coronary outcomes and reduce death from heart disease, which clearly supports the diet, cholesterol, heart disease hypothesis. So we'll look very closely at these studies. And finally, what I'm saying is it's not cholesterol that actually causes heart disease. So what actually is the more proximal cause of cardiovascular disease, if not cholesterol? So we go back to actually what were the experts saying in the 1950s showing in a sense our level of combination ignorance, but also agnosticism. What was it that we knew? And here's an editorial by the American Heart Association in 1957 as far as dietary fat and atherosclerosis. And it's very cautiously written. And it states that it is possible that the kind rather than the amount of fat actually contributes to atherosclerosis. But they emphasize that altering the dietary habits of a large population is fraught with dangers. Our knowledge is incomplete at this stage to make any strong recommendations as to any changes in diet that we would make for the general population. And they're really talking about concerns about recommending any change in fat consumption and specifically saturated or animal fat consumption. And so what we have is this fellow Ancel Keys. Ancel Keys I have here, who had a bachelor's degree in economics. His Ph.D. was in fish physiology. He had absolutely no expertise in cardiovascular disease or nutrition. You can see this from his writings and from his background. Ancel Keys was impressed when he was on sabbatical in Italy and he saw that those people were thin. And he was told that they ate very little fat. He decided, without any scientific basis, that it was because they had a low-fat diet that they were thin and had a low rate of heart disease. This man, who had absolutely no expertise in nutrition or cardiovascular disease, then became the dominant force in American nutrition and cardiovascular disease research. Here he is, soon after the American Heart Association warned about giving any guidance as to changes in diet in relation to heart disease. He is now featured on the cover of Time magazine. And what was it that he said in this article? Americans eat too much fat, mostly saturated fat. It increases cholesterol, damages arteries, and causes coronary disease. So the Americans must lower their blood cholesterol, reduce the fat in their diet to 15%, and cut saturated fat to 4%. It is so important to emphasize that he made this up. This is completely his idea. These numbers came out of nowhere. It was his idea that saturated fat would increase cholesterol and then cause heart disease. Completely contrary to what was known at the time, completely contrary to what we learned later. Now, to me, this would have been sort of an anecdote to ancient history. We could have dismissed Ancel Keys because we know he was wrong. We knew it at the time that he was wrong. And yet if one goes to the American Heart Association website today, you will see the very same information that Ancel Keys came up with in 1961. The same guidance is there now because he became a dominant force on the board of directors of the American Heart Association at the time, and they have continued with his legacy to continue with the guidance that he created. And so the American Heart Association still recommends only 5 to 6% of your calories from saturated fat, and they still recommend that you have margarine rather than butter. The remarkable thing is we have this coincidence. It's a bit of irony that in the very year in which Ancel Keys is presenting himself as the expert on heart disease and lipemia, a paper came out by Ed Ahrens of Rockefeller University, some real science, in which they actually had people on a very low-carb diet versus a very low-fat diet. And the effects were so powerful, so profound, that they actually showed a picture of the blood serum of the same individual on a long-term low-carb diet versus long-term low-fat diet. And here is a picture of the serum from the same person at the two different time points. And they call it carbohydrate-induced lipemia. And so what you have here is that they're saying the carb-induced lipemia is a common phenomenon, distinguished by caloric abundance and obesity. So here in their figure, they're illustrating carbohydrate-induced lipemia, and they point out that when the person is on a high-carb diet, it's actually here that you have the thicker serum. When the person is on the high-fat diet, what you see is much clearer serum. And clearly the biochemistry shows that the high carbohydrate diet results in an increase in triglycerides. Very simple biochemistry that Ancel Keys was completely unaware of and chose to ignore. Others had contempt for Ancel Keys, such as John Yudkin. And John Yudkin showed, when you look across countries here, epidemiological work, then you look at the relation of fat in the diet to death from heart disease. You see no significant association between fat in the diet in these world countries, but you do see a significant association here between sugar in the diet and death from heart disease. And so Yudkin battled with Ancel Keys for decades. And Ancel Keys basically bullied his way to the top and convinced people that it was fat in the diet. And he was completely against the idea that sugar in the diet would produce obesity and heart disease. And of course, he was wrong about that. Let's look at some more modern epidemiological work from the World Health Organization. It was Keys who actually said that it's the Italian and the Greek diet, which is low in fat, olive oil, grains, and a bit of lean meat. That's the ideal diet, according to Ancel Keys. He came up with this Mediterranean diet, which is now the standard. But if we actually look at what is now called the European paradox, here we have data from each of 40 European nations. And we look at, in those nations, the percent of calories and saturated fat compared to then the death from coronary heart disease. What we actually have is a negative correlation between saturated fat in the diet versus death from heart disease. Completely contrary again to what the American Heart Association is saying now and to what Ancel Keys said originally. And in fact, when we go to the most extreme data point, and that being France, in France, over 40% of their calories are from fat, and over 15% of their calories are from saturated fat. This is a country that was entirely ignored by Ancel Keys. It's been ignored by all of the diet recommendations that you should have a very low fat, particularly low saturated fat diet. And I love this quote from T.H. Huxley, which says, "The great tragedy of science, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact." The entire country of France is an ugly fact. 60 million people living in defiance of the American Heart Association and their recommendations. Thank you. And the way science is supposed to be, the way it was when I was really just a neuroscientist trying to understand how the brain works, the way science is supposed to work is you have a hypothesis. And when the data are contrary to the hypothesis, you change the hypothesis. But in the nutrition cardiovascular field, you don't change the hypothesis. You just sweep it aside and you call it a paradox. And that's why we have the French paradox. These people who dare to eat butter in France, they do not cook primarily with olive oil. The preferred cooking oil is butter. Butter which is still demonized by the American Heart Association. And they eat the liver, foie gras, and they have high-fat cheese. And these people have an extraordinary low level of heart disease. And not only that, do they have a low level of heart disease, they're so annoyingly thin. They eat so much fat. And yet these people are thin. So here we have in America where people are obsessed with low-fat food, and we're the fattest people in the world. And France, where you have less than 10% of the people are obese. And I can tell you I've been to France numerous times and I've enjoyed it very much. And when you see an obese person in France, it turns out it's an American on vacation. So if we actually look, it's amazing to say, well, the French drink wine and they walk to work. And so that's why it is. So that's the antidote to saturated fat. There are far better mechanisms to look at the reason why the French have a low rate of heart disease. And so here's actually a study on the Dutch, which is similar to the diet of the French. And what you actually find is those people who eat the most cheese, and in fact cheese, eggs, and liver, and which actually have the most vitamin K2. A vitamin is actually too often ignored, but a vitamin that is so important for getting calcium to be incorporated into bones and away from arteries. Those who consume the most cheese have a significantly lower rate of calcified arteries and a dramatically lower rate of heart disease. So completely contrary to recommendations is the highest consumption of saturated fat in this population is associated with the lowest rate of calcified arteries and heart disease. And yet, here we are in modern times. This fear of food that has cholesterol and saturated fat, which is perhaps best typified by this love-hate relationship we have with eggs, especially the egg yolks. Today, if you go to the Cleveland Clinic and look for nutritional advice, this is what you will find. The egg whites are safe because they don't have the cholesterol. It's the yolks that have the cholesterol and saturated fat that you need to fear. because that saturated fat, again, will raise your cholesterol and give you heart disease. So we see this pervasive warning about the cholesterol, and you go to the food locations, you go to Dunkin' Donuts, McDonald's, Starbucks, and you see the little heart next to the egg white omelets and the egg white sandwiches. And you see an entire industry based on having egg whites rather than the yolks. And it's very clear there just simply has never been any support for the idea that whole eggs have any adverse effect on cardiovascular outcomes. Here is one meta-analysis which actually looked at egg consumption in relation to heart disease. The conclusion is very straightforward. There simply is no association between whole egg consumption and risk of coronary heart disease or stroke. And here's a magnificent study conducted on two groups in which you have people on a low-carb diet, and the only difference is that one group is given 3 eggs, told to have 3 eggs consumed per day, 3 whole eggs. And in fact, the findings are outstanding. The group that actually had the 3 eggs per day, with the only difference between those two groups, they had greater weight loss, greater reduction of blood pressure, and in fact a greater increase in HDL, which is called the good cholesterol, and no difference in the groups in total cholesterol or LDL. So in fact, the conclusion of this group was that considering that we think of HDL as a risk factor, in fact you want the HDL to be higher, that eggs should actually be a preferred food for someone at risk for heart disease. And they also cite other literature showing clearly no relation of egg consumption to heart disease. And to bring this session to a close, what I want to point is just an outstanding summary of the research in this area of over a dozen scholars in this field led by Richard Feynman. And this really should be the guide for anyone with type 2 diabetes and anyone treating someone with type 2 diabetes. Here are just a couple of figures from that paper showing superior A1C reduction and superior reduction in blood sugar. This is something you've seen at this meeting. You'll be seeing it probably from Jeff as well after my talk. And just some other work as well showing overall improvement of metabolic markers of cardiovascular disease, which you find a superiority of the very low-carb diet compared to low-fat diet. There is one aspect of this we need to point out, and this is the fear of LDL. You see that very small increase in LDL. This is what your patients will point to. This is what the cardiologist will point to, is sure you're healthier. Sure, your blood pressure's down, your blood sugar's down, but that increase in LDL, that's going to kill you. That's what's going to clog your arteries. And so that's the big concern. That's the elephant in the room in any talk. And so let's just summarize with all the meta-analyses that have come out in the last few years as far as saturated fat and overall fat in the diet. The meta-analyses are very clear. In this paper from 2009, total fat in the diet, when you separate it from carbohydrates, is not associated with coronary events, and specifically intake of saturated fat not significantly associated with coronary events or mortality, and in fact there is no benefit to a reduction of fat in the diet as far as coronary events and overall mortality. There are so many other meta-analyses that have come out as well. You have a look at saturated and trans fats. Here's very nice work out of Zoe Harcombe and her dissertation work, ultimately looking at the conclusions that saturated fat consumption, specifically looking at that, is not related to all-cause mortality, cardiovascular, coronary heart disease, stroke, or type 2 diabetes. And so to bring this phase of the session to a close, I want to acknowledge just the outstanding work not only done by Jeff Volek and Steve Finney and Eric Westman and the others in this field who have just summarized the findings is so clear. Very nice, strong conclusion from Jeff that it's very clear that the very low-carb diet is highly effective, promoting not only fat loss, improving metabolic syndrome. The continued condemning of the low-carb diet is unjustified. And so, very clear, the first phase of my talk, in which you're hearing numerous times all through this meeting, is the answer is simply no. That there is no evidence that consumption of saturated fat in the context of a low-carb diet is clearly not unhealthy, does not increase risk for cardiovascular disease. Okay, but now what about LDL? This is the great fear we have. Even if every other marker goes in the right direction, what about the LDL? Clearly LDL increasing actually causes heart disease, blocks your arteries. So let's actually look at perhaps the most important paper in this field, which is the one that evokes the most fear in people about cholesterol and heart disease. So this is the Mr. Fit study in which you look at over 350,000 men followed for many years. And here you see a clear relation of cholesterol level to heart disease, death from heart disease. So what they're looking at is total cholesterol from the very lowest to the highest levels, and you see this graded increase. What's very clear, they're pointing out, is that every small increase in cholesterol levels increases the likelihood that you will die from heart disease. So it's not just the highest level, it is any small increase from the lowest level will increase your risk. And in fact, it is over 4 times the risk for those who have the highest level of cholesterol. And this is now proposed that they say that it is a 400% increase in death from cardiovascular disease with those that have the highest cholesterol. So let's look at this. And this is actually what they said. The relationship is graded. They emphasize that every small increase in cholesterol is continuous. And it puts the majority of men in America at risk for any increase in serum cholesterol. So a 1% increase in cholesterol, this is directly from the paper and from the news reports that come out with them, increases your risk by 2%. So it is a powerful, fear-provoking effect that you have here, as seen with this increase in cholesterol. Now, let's actually look at the data, because this is relative risk. People have failed to look closely at the actual data in this study. So what I'm going to show you is the actual rate of death from heart disease across the entire range of cholesterol. So in blue, what you see here is the actual rate in which people did not die of heart disease. Surprise, right? So in blue, you are seeing the entire range in which an adverse event did not occur, an adverse event being death. And so it's all at around 99% of the people at every stage of cholesterol, every phase, from the lowest to the highest. 99% of people did not die of heart disease, yet there is a 400% increase in risk. How is that? Well, if you actually look closely at the data, I can explain this to you. At the lowest level of cholesterol, what you find is 99.7% of the people did not die of coronary heart disease. Those with the very highest level of cholesterol, 98.7% of these people did not die of heart disease. Across the entire range of cholesterol, the difference is 1%. And so if you have cholesterol over 290, total cholesterol 290, and you ask your doctor, what's the likelihood I am not going to die of heart disease? You have the answer right here. You have basically 99% likelihood you will not die of heart disease with the highest cholesterol. You're a heck of a lot more likely to die in a car accident than you are of heart disease with that kind of cholesterol. So how do you get this 400% increase? Well, you take the 0.3% that died at the lowest level, you have 1.3% that died at the highest level, you then do a little bit of statistical hijinks, manipulation. You take 1.3, you divide it by 0.3, you end up with 4.13. And that is a 400% increase in the rate of death. Jeremiah Stamler is no longer alive, but frankly, if he were here now, I would say you should be ashamed of yourself for taking these kind of data and provoking people to have such a fear of such a trivial relation between coronary heart disease and cholesterol. But by this time, the cholesterol cartel had become too powerful to fail. And so this kind of trivial finding with cholesterol then became a mandate that people needed to lower their cholesterol. So let's notch it up a little bit. Let's actually take a disease. This is something every medical student learns about, which is extremely high cholesterol found in familial hypercholesterolemia, which is a result of a mutation in the LDL receptor. And so these people have 2, 3, 4 times normal levels of cholesterol. And here in this paper from 1950s, what you see actually is that high cholesterol is associated with cholesterol in the plaque, and it's seen as an early coronary death. Anyone with this disease dies young, and so clearly it's the cholesterol that actually kills people. So if we look more closely at the literature, we find actually that there are actually contrary findings to this. But let's actually ask the hypothesis then. If it is cholesterol that's actually causing people to die, then what we should find is that these people that have a high level of cholesterol should consistently, and a high percentage of them, die young, because of the cholesterol. And second, if we lower their cholesterol levels with pharmacological approaches, well, then we should see a substantial percentage of the people now would survive. So here is the first major paper looking at multiple generations of individuals diagnosed with familial hypercholesterolemia, extremely high levels of cholesterol, and their findings are unequivocal. Looking at over 1,000 people, multiple generations of people with this disease, their conclusions are we find no evidence that individuals diagnosed with familial hypercholesterolemia have a shorter lifespan. To the contrary, we find that people with extremely high cholesterol, 300, 400, 500 total cholesterol, live into their 7th and 8th decades. And there are about a half a dozen other studies, such as this one in JAMA, published in 1986, clearly evidence that people with this diagnosis can avoid an early coronary death. Men heterozygous for familial hypercholemia have a normal lifespan. And if I had the time, I'd show you about a half a dozen studies, all showing normal lifespan in people who have extraordinarily high levels of cholesterol. And this one I like as well. Here's a longitudinal study in which you have cholesterol levels from people now followed out 20 years. And what their conclusion was, as a result of it, people aged 70 into their 90s, is that people who have the lowest cholesterol actually have significantly greater mortality. Those who had the highest cholesterol were healthier and lived the longest. And it's right here. In fact, you follow their cholesterol over the decades, and those who consistently have low cholesterol have a significantly higher rate of mortality. And the findings are very clear because the people with the low cholesterol are much more susceptible to cancer and infectious diseases and not more susceptible to cardiovascular disease. And I really enjoy their interpretation. We have been unable to explain our results. How candid can this be? It's like everybody told us that cholesterol was so bad for these people, and yet here they are, they're healthier and they're living longer. And they say very, very straightforward, the data cast doubt on the justification for the reduction of cholesterol to lower concentrations in elderly people. And I want to emphasize, the over 60 to 70 years of age is when most heart attacks occur. So this is the prime age of life when you would expect people to develop heart disease, or at least develop and show the heart disease and die of it, and yet these people are not dying of coronary heart disease. One more study, actually, again, to show that this impression you have of high cholesterol consistently killing people at a young age is inaccurate. So we have another study, again, this is in the pre-statin era, when people are not being treated to reduce their cholesterol. So here are people diagnosed with familial hypercholesterolemia. Their cholesterol is extraordinarily high, almost 350, and that's in the danger zone. So the recommendations are that your total cholesterol should be below 200. So these are men and women in the prime age to develop heart disease, 60 to 74 years of age, followed for 10 years. And so in mortality rate, what you are comparing is their rate of death to the rate of death in the general population. The general population being at 100%. And so if their rate of death is higher than the general population, they would be greater than 100%. If they are dying at a lower rate than the general population, then their rate of death would be less than 100%. So when you have these people who have extraordinarily high cholesterol, follow them for 10 years, look at the rate of death, and you find a significantly lower rate of death in those people that have astronomically high cholesterol levels, a 31% reduced rate of death. And the conclusions that I've cut directly from the article is that a striking finding was the reduced risk of all-cause mortality and specifically a reduced risk of coronary heart disease death. And so there are many more studies that I can show, but what we have here is a paper that I've had the pleasure to work with some outstanding clinician scientists. Over a dozen of us got together and we reviewed the entire literature on LDL cholesterol and coronary and all-cause mortality. We published this last year in BMJ. And what we found was that there's absolutely no evidence that in older people, that is, anyone over 60, of all the studies that have been published, what you find is either an equal to the general population as far as all-cause mortality, and you even find significant reduction in mortality in those that have the highest LDL cholesterol. So we know that total cholesterol improves longevity, as well as specifically what's called the bad cholesterol. And it's not so bad, actually, if you look at it, because the higher it is, the longer you live. And here are our conclusions. Elderly people with the highest LDL live as long or longer than those with low LDL. So we certainly want now to question the validity of the cholesterol hypothesis, that cholesterol is inherently atherogenic. So the second phase of my talk, is there actual evidence that cholesterol itself is atherogenic, that having high cholesterol causes heart disease? The answer is clearly no. Now the third point, and that is cholesterol reduction. Well, clearly the statins are seen as wonder drugs. You reduce your cholesterol with the statins, you live longer, you have a lower rate of heart disease. So is that actually the case? Let's look at the cholesterol lowering literature. And so what you had in 1984 was a watershed event. Watershed event because it was the first time it had been shown that cholesterol reduction actually saved lives. And they have, rather than cover the entire literature leading up to this, they have a sentence in their introduction that summarizes the 20 years of research in which through surgery, drugs, and various different treatments, lowering cholesterol have been shown to be ineffective at saving lives, especially from cardiovascular disease. This was the study that would do it right. This was the first study in which you could actually lower cholesterol and potentially then show that you could save lives. So this was a massive, over $100 million study funded by NIH in which you tested about 500,000 men, chose those who had the highest levels of cholesterol, an average of 290, and they were treated with the drug cholestyramine, which is a bile sequestering agent and reduces dramatically cholesterol levels. Followed for 7.5 years, an enormous study. Never before undertaken, but clearly to take the men who were on their deathbed with the highest levels of cholesterol, they would reduce their cholesterol and show that lives would be saved. And this was the first success. In this study, those that were given cholestyramine had a significantly lower level of cholesterol and a 24% reduction in death from coronary heart disease. So this was a powerful effect, in which for the first time you could show that lowering cholesterol would actually save lives. There was a problem with that study, however. The risk of death from all causes was not reduced in those given cholestyramine. You can ask, how is it possible that you can reduce death from heart disease by 24% and yet, of all those individuals given cholestyramine, there is no mortality benefit? So here again, let's actually look at the data in this study. Here are the data, cholestyramine versus placebo. And it's a bit like a Where's Waldo kind of puzzle. I dare anyone to find a 24% benefit in any comparison of placebo versus cholestyramine. But these are the actual data from the study. And again, this is showing the absence of an adverse event kind of being death. That's an adverse event. So the absence of death would be survival. So I've grabbed here survival. These people who have extraordinarily high levels of cholesterol, what you have is 98% of them in either group, virtually identical data in the two groups, and this is why there is no mortality benefit to lowering the cholesterol. So where is the 24% benefit? It's right here. That little sliver right there, that is a 24% reduction in death from coronary heart disease between the two groups. This is not the kind of graph you'll see if you go to a medical convention supported by a pharmaceutical company. But this is actually the real data, which most people are just simply not looking at. So how can it be that this is a 24% reduction? Well, what you actually have is a 1.6% rate of death in those treated with cholestyramine versus a 2% rate of death in the placebo. The actual difference produced by the drug is 0.4%. 500,000 men coming down to a difference of 8 people between the treated and untreated groups. How do you turn a 0.4% effect, which actually was not statistically significant, they actually resorted to a one-tailed t-test to be able to produce this effect. How do you turn a 0.4% into a 24% effect? This is where you can use relative risk, which is basically a convenient way of cheating to be able to magnify and amplify minuscule effects. So you have a 0.4%, which is the difference between the groups. You divide that by 1.6%, which is the rate in the treated group. You end up with 24%. You can create a 24% effect out of a 0.4%. Amusing, isn't it, right? It's amazing. Okay, so really what they should have said, had they been unbiased, was that this study was a total failure. There were trivial effects on coronary events, no effect on overall mortality. And here it is, just as Ancel Keys was on Time magazine, this study ended up now on Time magazine. The director, Basil Rifkin, said, it is a turning point in cholesterol heart disease research. We can now save lives, which is what is in this article. And the most important thing they pointed out, that what we now need to do is develop more effective drugs than cholestyramine, those that are more easy to take and more effective. And that is what ushered in the statin era. So it's really important to understand that critical study actually had no statistical effect on mortality from heart disease and a trivial effect on coronary events. So we now have the statin era in which we now need to control cholesterol with statins. And so one of the most effective studies, one of the most effective reductions of cholesterol with outcomes is the one on Lipitor. So because of a limitation in time, what I'm going to show you are the two most effective, most impressive studies on statins. The first is the one on Lipitor, in which it has now become a wonder drug, reducing coronary events by 36%. So let's actually look at this study closely. Here are the data for this study. And again, the data show those subjects that did not have an adverse event. And again, looking placebo versus atorvastatin, which is Lipitor. And so again, look for that 36% reduction in events. You see here there is no difference in mortality. We look at it the inverse, which is survival. These asterisks here indicate statistical significance, again, for trivial effects. So when we look for that 36% effect, it is right here. That difference right there is the wonder drug effect. That is a 36% reduction. And they, in fact, had to combine different events in absence of non-fatal MI as well as fatal coronary heart disease. Combining these different events enabled them to have a statistically significant effect, which is right here and obviously so trivial. But how is this a 36% reduction in risk? Well, the actual rate was a 98.1% rate of coronary events and death in those given the Lipitor, and those given the placebo had a 97% rate in which there was no MI, there was no cardiovascular event whatsoever. And if you think about it, just getting the placebo means that you have a 97% chance of not having a heart attack and not dying of heart disease with all the side effects one might have from placebo, okay, which is nothing. And so taking nothing gives you a 97% chance of not having a heart attack. But we follow that up, and how is it that 1.1% difference becomes a 36%? And in fact, we look at the ad, and they actually show this to you. The 36%, let's look more closely. Here it is in the ad. Did anyone notice the blue font on the blue background? They're actually showing you the real data. And that is that in the placebo, what you have is 3% had a heart attack, and in those taking Lipitor, 2%. So you have two sets of data. You have two sets of findings with the same data. You have a 1% difference, and you have a 36% difference from the same set of data. So we actually go to the study. 1.1% is the difference between the groups. We divide that by 3%, which is the difference between 100 and the placebo rate. You now have 36%. Do you see how deceptive this field has been? How completely lacking integrity these scientists are to promote a drug that has minuscule, trivial effects on reducing death and incidence of cardiovascular disease, of inflating a 1% effect into the perceived 36%, creating wonder drugs out of nothing. So realize that under ideal conditions in this study, only 1 out of 100 patients, a random 1 out of 100, will actually benefit. And that benefit is 1 less heart attack over 2 to 3 years in only 1 out of every 100 people who are treated compared to placebo. So in fact, I've modified the ad. If we're talking about truth in advertising, this really is what the ad should appear. Doctors should see that, in fact, statins reduce the risk of heart disease by 1%. Isn't that fantastic? The wonder drugs certainly lose their appeal when you see the real data. One more study I need to show you, and that's Jupiter, because now Crestor is tending to replace Lipitor as the chief statin to be promoted for people at risk of heart disease. And so John Castelline, who led this study, said, it's spectacular. We have strong data, not only that we are reducing the incidence of heart disease, but we can prevent a heart attack with Crestor. So again, we look at the data. Okay? Here are the data that you will see when you attend a conference that is put on by a pharmaceutical company. And this is what you see when you get CME credit for then promoting the use of statins in heart disease. And so here is this robust effect of the Crestor from this study, a 44% reduction in heart disease in those treated with Crestor. So let's actually look closely at this study. The study was actually terminated at 1.9 years, right about here. It was terminated for ethical reasons. So many lives were being saved that they needed to terminate the study. You know where I'm going with this. So here is the actual 44% difference is when they terminated. And it's important now to look closely at the data. The scale actually goes from 0 to 1.0. And that 1.0 means everybody would die of heart disease. So you are looking here at the incidence of death from heart disease and the incidence of coronary events. So I want to prepare you for what you will be seeing in the next slide. This is not my graph. I have cut and pasted the graph directly from the paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. This is a 44% effect. The same graph that I just showed you, the same data, are now represented in the original study. And if you look closely and you get out your electron microscope, you will see right here, that is a 44% difference between these two lines. Just as with Jeremiah Stamler, I think John Castelline should be shamed for presenting this as a way of completely eliminating heart disease. You are looking here at the incidence of heart attacks and death from coronary heart disease. This is shameful, in my opinion. And again, looking at the actual data, what you find is the absence of non-fatal MI and fatal coronary heart disease. Combining the two produces statistically significant effect. What you have is the rate in which there was no evidence of heart disease in the Crestor rosuvastatin, 98.4% compared to 97.2% in placebo. That difference is 1.2%. The difference, 1.2 divided by 2.8, gives you 44%. You can then create a 44% effect from a 1% effect. And this is why the ads for Crestor say you can reduce the incidence of heart disease by almost half, which is very impressive. But when you actually look at the raw data, you find that difference, again, is only about 1%. So we have inflated claims for minuscule benefits. What's also important, and I would suggest why they stopped this study at 2 years, was not such a reason for ethical guidelines, not because they were saving so many lives, but they started to see that these people were reporting that they were developing diabetes. So the first point is that when you look at the effectiveness of the Crestor, what you find is you need to treat these patients for 2 years, 95 patients treated for 2 years, and you reduce the incidence of heart attacks by in only one person. And here it is that new onset diabetes. Healthy people starting out, which then report the incidence of diabetes. And here, rather than promoting this effect, rather than putting this in their summary, rather than stating this as relative risk, which is now actually relative harm, they didn't calculate it, but I did it for them. And so we take the increased incidence of diabetes, which is now a 24% increase in the incidence of diabetes. Now, this is actually a rather trivial finding. It's only 0.6% of the people. But if we want to be fair, we have to calculate it the same way. I mean, we have a 24% increase in diabetes. Forget the fact that it's only 0.6% of the people, because I'm telling you how dangerous this drug is. But what's important in this study is they were not looking for diabetes. This is self-reported diabetes. This is what they were telling the people in this study, that there is diabetes being developed. And so what we do have is incidental observation of an increase in diabetes. This has been confirmed in studies in which you've actually looked at the incidence of diabetes, in which you get A1C and fasting blood sugar before people go on the statins and compare that to placebo. So here's a very nice study following people for years, in which you then look at the incidence of diabetes, and you do see a near doubling in the rate of diabetes from about 6% to near 12% of otherwise healthy people that develop diabetes when they are on the statins. There are so many other adverse events which have been minimized by the statin industry, published in major medical journals: reduction of testosterone levels, erectile dysfunction, kidney disease, muscle atrophy, all well-described adverse effects. And you see numerous reviews have come out in peer-reviewed medical journal. The incidence of type 2 diabetes is now very well described. And in particular, cancer, what you do find is these studies are typically stopped at about 3 years, which is, in general, too soon to be able to see cancer. You do see a significant increase in cancer in older people who are on statins. And here is an example of a study in which you have a doubling in the rate of breast cancer followed over 10 years in women who are on statins. So there is a clear link of statins use to cancer as well. So the adverse effects are very broad. They cover different systems. There is no doubt for that 1% benefit you get by lowering your cholesterol that the adverse effects are profound. And all this talk about going off your statins, that when you go off a statin you're going to die of heart disease, is not at all supported by the research. Here is a meta-analysis showing very conclusively that there is no mortality benefit to cholesterol reduction with statins. So it is simply a fallacy that people have been promoting. The pharmaceuticals and cardiologists have promoted the idea that if you go off your statin, you're increasing the likelihood that you'll die. That is simply not supported by the research. Much of what I presented in this phase of the lecture, I published with Ofi Rabenskov, and we were able to get in peer-reviewed medical journal this extraordinary title in which we combine both statins with the deception that is in this field. So what I've described for you today in this section is in our paper, in which we summarize that elevated cholesterol is not associated with heart disease, especially in the aged people who are at most risk for dying of heart disease. We describe the deceptive practices that I've shared with you today in this publication of ours, and we also described in great detail that the small benefits of the statins are clearly offset by their adverse effects. And so, is there a benefit to cholesterol reduction? A very slight one, which is clearly offset then by the adverse effects. And finally, now, if it is not cholesterol, then what is it that's actually contributing to coronary heart disease and coronary mortality? So here's another study of people with extraordinarily high cholesterol. And you actually see it's divided into two groups. You have people with extremely high total cholesterol over 300, the LDL, which is recommended to be below 100 and preferably below 70. These people have an LDL of 250, and the HDL and the triglycerides. And what you're seeing is two groups. We have one group in which there is no coronary heart disease diagnosed, the other is diagnosed with heart disease. And there is no statistical difference between the two groups in terms of their blood lipids. What is the difference between the two groups are their clotting factors. Those that have been diagnosed with coronary heart disease have significantly greater baseline clotting factors, such as fibrinogen here in factor 8. And so the difference is not in the lipids, it is in the clotting factors. Here is another study, more recent one, in which you see no difference in LDL levels. And look at how astronomically high the LDL levels are. Whereas the LDL is supposed to be below 100, again, here are people that have LDL levels at about 300, which is not influenced at all by any kind of statin treatment. You do see lower HDL and higher triglycerides, which are risk factors for heart disease. But what really matters in this study is showing that there is a polymorphism for a clotting factor, and that is prothrombin. And what you find is those people who have this polymorphism for the gene for prothrombin actually have a dramatic increase in the incidence of coronary heart disease, over 2.5 times the incidence of heart disease in those that have this polymorphism. And that is completely independent of their LDL levels. And so again, there is a vast amount of research that clearly links clotting factors to coronary heart disease. And here we're looking at fibrinogen, the primary protein of clotting factors. What you find is for both coronary heart disease and stroke, that there is a clear link of fibrinogen level to the incidence of cardiovascular disease. When you do not find, when you look at cholesterol levels, and this is independent of cholesterol levels. And I've just summarized the vast literature here in which you look at all of the risk factors for cardiovascular disease. They are all linked mechanistically, ultimately, to clotting factors. And so whether you look at metabolic syndrome, smoking, advanced stage, stress, hypertension, and in a subset of people with familial hypercholesterolemia, what you find is increased clotting factors. And it's the clotting factors in those that have this affliction that are linked then to premature coronary heart disease. And I want to emphasize again for this group that in fact it is high blood sugar that triggers the clotting factors, that lowers the threshold for these clotting factors to become activated. So ultimately keeping blood sugar low, especially with a ketogenic diet, reduces the likelihood that these clotting factors will become activated. So what I want to summarize is actually through the words of people I've admired, some of my heroes. And so what I'm going to start with is George Mann, who battled with Ancel Keys for decades. And so for the first component of my talk, George Mann said that a generation of citizens has grown up since the diet-hard hypothesis was launched as dogma by Ancel Keys. You've been misled by the greatest scientific deception of our times, that consumption of saturated or animal fat actually causes heart disease. So the first section I talked about was, it is very clear, saturated fat consumption in the context of a low-carb diet is not only safe, it's also very effective, it's also beneficial. The second from Dr. Paul Roche, friend and colleague of mine, having to do with actual cholesterol levels in relation to atherosclerosis, said the belief that coronary atherosclerosis to high cholesterol has been perpetuated by powerful forces using tactics to preserve the profits and reputations of those who promote this doctrine, can state categorically, absolutely, there is simply no support for the belief, the hypothesis, that cholesterol is inherently atherogenic. And finally, Uffe Ravenscoff, who I've had the great pleasure to work with and publish with, said the diet-hard hypothesis is sustained by social, political, and particularly financial institutions, which have little to do with science or any established success in public health. It is very clear that it is the conflict of interest, the powerful forces from pharmaceutical companies, and the powerful and obscene amounts of profits that have been generated by the diet-hard hypothesis and the so-called wonder drugs which lower cholesterol. That has been a great and detrimental influence on our area. I also like the quote from Sir Isaac Asimov, who said, if I've seen further, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants who have come before me. And I feel the same way about all the great researchers who I have benefited from. I have stood on the shoulders of giants who have conducted this research, which I've shared with you today. And in part, I have a chapter in this book with Uffe Ravenscoff, and there are over 20 other authors in this area who published with this great title of the book, Fat and Cholesterol Don't Cause Heart Attacks, and Statins Are Not the Solution. So I highly recommend this book as a follow-up to the talk that I have given today, and in recognition of so many investigators who are providing accurate information on the real science underlying cardiovascular disease risk. I thank you very much for your attention.